Welcome to today's USBI Biochar in the Woods webinar. There are over 120 registered for today's events, and you range from business owners, fire chief, foresters, soil and environmental scientists, educators, researchers, arborists, students, and many more than I can name. Thank you for coming. I'm Carol Greenberg Ribley, USBI Communications Lead, and we have an exciting day of speakers and look forward to teaching you how to apply biochar in the woods to improve soil resilience and sequester carbon. You'll hear from over 15 speakers, as I said, so we're going to move at a swift clip so we can get through all the information we've prepared for you. The day is divided into 4 blocks, and rest assured you'll have plenty of time to ask questions after each of these blocks. We'll start with an overview of flame cap kilns and conservation burns. This will take us to about 11:40, and then we'll break for questions, followed by a break for lunch. When we resume at 12:45 p.m., we'll get into project logistics and economics until 2. Then from 2 to 3, we'll address project environmental impacts. And from 3 to 4, we'll tackle technology development. Just so you know, we will be sending all registrants a link to today's webinar recording, as well as a list of all speakers' emails. So if you have to leave us before the webinar ends this afternoon, you will be able to see the parts that you missed. Some guidelines about questions now. We would appreciate you asking your questions as you think of them. We'll be setting up the questions after each panel rather than each speaker. Also, if you could enter your questions in the Q&A area rather than the chat, that will help us a lot. It's also just fine to enter your questions during presentations rather than waiting till the end of each one. Now, if you have more general questions, please send them to our USBI email address, which I will put in the chat, and we will do our very best to answer them. Okay, technical difficulties. If you're having difficulties today, try switching to Chrome, refreshing your screen, or logging out of the meeting and then logging back in. All right, now it's time to welcome Kelpie Wilson of Wilson Biochar Associates. Kelpie is a mechanical engineer and analyst with 35 years of experience in renewable energy and sustainable forestry. Since 2008, she's focused on biochar and consults with farmers, private industry, and government agencies through her company. She also designs, manufactures, and sells biochar kilns. Kelpie has been the driving force behind this program, pulling together all of today's experts. Welcome, Kelpie.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for that introduction, and I will share my screen. All right. Yes, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this. I also would like to thank our partners who've helped put this event on. The CSU Chico Ecological Reserves, the Butte Fire Safe Council, Applied Biomass Technicians, and the Butte Community College District, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. These partners are, most of the Butte County partners are going to be involved in our field days that are coming up next week. And the U.S. Forest Service has been a generous sponsor of this webinar. So thanks to all of our partners and sponsors. Thank you to my colleagues at USBI for helping me get this all together. And thanks especially to all of our presenters today. So let's just dive into this. I'm going to start with an overview of really, what this is all about. A little bit more about me. I've been a biochar consultant since 2012. Before that, I worked for the International Biochar Initiative when it was just getting started. And then I came to that as a journalist and science writer. Before that, I actually worked as a forest protection advocate here in the Siskiyou National Forest for many years. And I got started as a mechanical engineer with my degree from Chico. So as Carol mentioned, we have a wide variety of folks here. And this is the audience that this information is really aimed at, including forestry contractors and the people who actually work in the woods, the people who are designing and implementing projects in the woods, the agencies that are funding it, also the landowners who are concerned with their land, and residents who live in that wildland urban interface. And then finally, really, this is for anyone who cares about forest health and climate change. So what is the problem we're trying to solve here with biochar in the woods, and how can biochar in the woods help? I'm also going to briefly touch on what is biochar and then get deep into the technology and techniques for making it in the woods, the economics, the carbon and climate impact, and then finally talk about some of the knowledge gaps, what we need to make progress into the future. What is the problem? The problem is in the Western US and throughout the world, in many places, climate change, drought, and a century of fire suppression of natural fire has created a wildfire crisis that threatens our ecosystems and our communities. As we see these forests go up in smoke, we're also experiencing the loss of one of our most important natural carbon sinks. And this is coming at a time when we really need to rely on these natural carbon sinks more and more to draw down carbon. This is the problem. We're losing these incredible forests. The coastal forests of Oregon and Washington and California are they're the greatest forests on the planet in terms of carbon storage. It's been pretty well documented that the sheer amount of carbon in these ancient forests is astounding. And unfortunately, these are starting to go away more and more because of all the mismanagement problems, because of climate change and drought. And so we see that projections are that these cool, moist, evergreen forests are going to be transitioning more and more towards mixed forests, towards oaks and hardwood forests. And so we need to recognize that, deal with it, plan for it, and do our best to make sure we at least still have forest cover in this region. And of course, these high severity fires we've been experiencing the last few years are not helping at all. This is a few miles up the road from my house, a wilderness that I've spent the last 35 years exploring. And up until a couple of years ago, this was all lush green forest. And now, who knows what it's going to be? It's in a transition. Draw your attention particularly to the state of the soil. After the fire came through here, the soils have been definitely damaged. So how are we addressing the fire problem as residents who live here, as people concerned about the forests? Well, there's a lot of effort now to do pre-fire vegetation management, to thin some of these fuels. You know, across the landscape around the wildland urban interface, and remove this and either burn it in place or chip it. And then after fire, there's still a lot of biomass that needs to be dealt with, that continues to be a fire hazard. And this also needs to be removed. So these are mandatory activities. We have to do this to continue to survive in this area. So my big question here is, how can we leverage these activities to improve forest soils for the future? Well, biochar could be part of the answer. And one reason why we know it's going to be good is because it's natural. So the amount of charcoal generated by wildfire really depends on a lot of factors: fire intensity, fire return interval, etc. But overall, about between 10 and 50% of the total carbon found in the forest soils in the West is charcoal. And researchers have speculated that by excluding fire for the past 100 or so years, what we've done is we have eliminated a really, biochemically important form of carbon in the soil ecosystem. So it is my personal anecdote that this is biochemically important. And this is a bag of biochar that was sitting in my backyard for about 6 months. And I went to dig it out of the bag one day and I noticed all these roots growing up through the bag, and there was quite a lot of them. And I realized they're coming from the pine trees adjacent, and their fine root hairs are going right into that biochar. So obviously there's something about it that they really like. And so if trees want biochar, I say, let's give it to them. So how do we do that? Well, let's look at different management effects on forest char. As I've said before, fire suppression has reduced the amount of natural charcoal in forest soils. And so if we deal with that problem by thinning the forest, but we don't follow it up with prescribed fire, then we really haven't done much. However, management that increases char in forest soils are things like frequent low intensity fires, so the natural fire regime. And so that Bremer in 2006 found that sites that experienced multiple fires contain 3 times more char than sites where fire was excluded. We could also do forest thinning followed by prescribed fire. That's actually really what we need to do. But finally, we can do biochar in the woods. And that's sort of the first step before we do the prescribed fire. So what are the goals of biochar in the woods? Our long-term goal overall is to protect and enhance forests as natural carbon sinks and sources of clean water, air, and biological diversity. The strategies for that, again, are to first do the vegetation thinning, then make biochar on site to leave on site, and then follow that at a certain period of time by prescribed fire with the goal of returning that natural regenerative fire regime. What are the short-term goals of doing these projects in the woods? Because we have to justify the work on the short term as well. Well, first of all, sequestering carbon, making char, leaving it on site for measurable carbon sequestration. And then second of all, avoiding some negative impacts from burn piles. Smoke emissions, obviously, biochar burn techniques are much cleaner. And then burn pile impacts, the fire scar that gets left behind on a standard burn pile. Here's an example of one where you can see the mineral soil has been burned away by this burn pile. And then a rain event comes along and you start getting erosion. And of course, there is, when you burn a lot of piles all at once, you will see a fair amount of smoke. And then there's some medium-term goals too. And this is an area of active research. So how can applying biochar in the forest help with forest regeneration, post-fire recovery, and drought resistance? There are a lot of ideas here. This is just a few of them, but first of all, as in any soil, when you apply biochar, it reduces soil bulk density. It can alleviate compaction and improve soil aggregates. So overall, general soil health improvement. You could also, if there are areas impacted by mining or oil spills or other industrial activities, it can help absorb toxins. You could use biochar targeted strategically around legacy trees that need a little help to improve soil moisture and nutrient cycling. You could use it in nursery pots and tree planting to help retain moisture and nutrients. And then there's a lot of interesting ideas about rebuilding the soil microbiome by using biochar inoculated with mycorrhizal spores or other biological agents. Here's an example of using biochar in a tree nursery. You can see on the right, the root system of the seedling that's grown in biochar looks much more robust, as well as the above ground growth. So here's just a couple of research questions about using biochar in the woods for regeneration. Will biochar mixed with wood mulch build soil faster than either one alone? So we can use a variety of materials to help rebuild the forest soils. Could we use hydrophilic, so wet, nice, well-wetted biochar in post-fire recovery to rehab hydrophobic soils that have been burned? And can we identify microsites in forests that could benefit most from biochar? So like I was talking about, preserving and helping legacy trees, maybe riparian areas. There's a lot of ideas here, and I hope we're going to hear from some of our speakers later about these. So let me backtrack just a minute and talk about what is biochar for those of you who might be new to this idea. Well, the answer is really simple. Biochar is charcoal that you can add to soil. And, so there's a variety of different materials that are called char. So biochar is just those materials that are safe to add to soil and will not have toxic compounds in them. And then the upshot, I could go into all the chemistry of that and biology of that, but the upshot is that biochar is a habitat for microbes. So it's electrically charged. It's got a lot of surface area that microbes can live on. They can exchange nutrients, they can access water, and they can work together, exchanging electrons and improving their metabolism together and basically have a big party. And that's what soil health is. Soil health is when the microbes are happy. That's a simple view. All right, so now the next question is, how is biochar formed? So biochar, its answer again is simple, is formed by heat. So for instance, if you take a piece of wood and you heat it, what happens is it shrinks, but it still retains its structure on this cellular scale. So you've got all the cell walls and the vascular structure still there, all those pores. And then on the nanoscale, the molecular scale, though, it transforms quite a bit because you see you've got all these fused carbon rings, the benzene rings in lignin and cellulose. And what happens when you add heat is this is all hydrogen and oxygen, and it volatilizes and leaves, and then the remaining carbon rings fuse and condense into these graphene sheets. So that's what's happening on the nanoscale. Then on the human or macro scale, what's happening is what we call pyrolysis. So from fire and separation, you've got a pile of fuel, biomass, you heat it and you get tars and gases, and you're left behind with char. So I'm going to talk now about some of the on-site production techniques now that we've had a view of how, the basic chemistry behind making biochar. And I'm going to talk about first how not to make biochar before I get into all these other techniques. So how not to make biochar is the traditional way that humans have been using for thousands of years to make fuel charcoal. So it's a more of a low temperature process. It's smoldering combustion, so no flame, but lots of smoke, very polluting. And the fuel charcoal that's made is very high in condensed volatiles because some of that smoke is going to condense back in. And it makes a good fuel, but it's not so great for biochar. And it's a polluting process, so we don't want to do this. Here's the way forward, a flame carbonization. And this is a photo of a method of making a filter charcoal, like activated carbon, that's been developed by the Jack Daniel's whiskey company for many years. And this is a good idea, not just because whiskey might be involved, but because it makes a really good, clean, high temperature charcoal that's pretty easy to use in soil. And it really mimics a lot of the kind of char formation that happens in a wildfire. So how this works, flame carbonization, making biochar in an open flame. The reason why it works is because biomass doesn't just burn. Wood doesn't just burn, it burns in stages, very distinct stages. The first stage is drying, where moisture is driven off by heat. And then come all the volatiles that we've been talking about, the gases. And that's what burns in a flame. And then once those are all gone, you're left with the char that kind of glows like you see in a barbecue grill. And at that point, it's continuing to burn, but not in a flame. And so you have a chance to interrupt the process at that time before it goes to ash and save the char. So, and you can see from the picture of the log there, what we're doing essentially is burning away the outer portion of a piece of wood in order to get the heat to penetrate to the center and char the center, and then we put it out. It's really simple and really basic, and it works. So here are the two basic techniques that we've been developing over, and this is it's a big group of people all over the world have been working on these things. So first, the conservation burn, just an open burn pile that has 3 characteristics. It's a loosely stacked pile for good airflow. We light it on the top so a flame is always present to burn the smoke and provide heat. And then at the end, we quench it to save the char. The flame cap kiln, the second technique, is just like a conservation burn, but inside a container. And furthermore, once the initial pile has charred, we can continue to add more biomass until the container is full. And then at the end, we quench it and save the char. Here's an illustration of conservation burn, what it looks like. Lighting the piles on the top, quenching with water later. Here I am looking at one of these piles a year later to see what it looks like on the ground. And you can see all these things are growing there. We've done a good thing for the soil. Here's the difference between top lighting and bottom lighting, or lighting underneath. A lot of us think we know that heat rises. Different methods of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. So you have to put the flame way under the biomass to get it going. Well, actually, heat transfers by radiation just as well. So we can actually light things on the top and get a whole pile going that way and avoid some smoke. Here's again a picture before and after of a standard burn pile that burns completely to ash. And these piles are made this way because we need to get rid of the material because it's a fire danger. But by burning it all the way to ash, then we've destroyed the soil in a little patch underneath it, which is a shame. And sometimes these scars can be very long lasting. Okay, so here's a picture from a recent conservation burn that we did. A whole lot of piles. We didn't have water right there, so we used a backpack pump, and the technique is to spray it and rake it. And this is what it looks like afterwards, comparing different piles. Of the piles that we sprayed and raked, we could see unburned fir needles under the char, and the organic soil is fine. The piles that were not quenched, burned, there's some char left, but the soil is pretty much gone under those piles. And here's what it looks like, in the spring after a water quenched pile. Everything's sprouting up as usual. So what do you need for a conservation burn? In order to do a project, say you've got a 20-acre site with several hundred piles on it, you need a hand crew. You need to show them how to light piles on the top or near the top. The crew needs to spend a little bit of time tending piles and quenching with water. And you need, of course, some water, so a water tender or backpack pumps. Here's a large conservation burn. And these have been pioneered by various people. We tried one on the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. And then the Sonoma Biochar Initiative has been a real pioneer in these techniques, where they've been working with grapevines, but also some forestry. And the way to do this is, these are machine-made piles, but instead of pushing them together with a bulldozer, they're made with a mini excavator that drops onto the pile. So for a large conservation burn, you would need an excavator to make those loosely stacked piles, and you would light it on top, and then use a water tender, and if possible, a skid steer or other equipment with a rake to help rake it so you don't have to do it by hand. All right, so now getting into the flame cap kiln and how this technology works. And you can see from this picture why we wanted to call it a flame cap, because when you put the pile in a container, the flame tends to come down and hover over the fuel. And the idea really came from, as far as I'm aware, from Japan. And this company called the Moki Company, manufacturing and selling these pans that could make charcoal. And the way it works is basically by cutting off the air from the bottom of the sides. You can have the flame on top that radiates heat down below to char the material underneath. And it doesn't burn until you put it out. The char doesn't burn because oxygen can't get in there. The flames use up all the oxygen. And these can be any shape. There's been a tremendous number of different designs out there. People have used found objects, pits in the ground. Designing your kiln so it fits your feedstock really makes a lot of sense. So if you have long sticks, you might want to trench. And so there's a very active area of investigation and invention going on all around the world. One of the things that I found most intriguing about this flame cap kiln is the countercurrent flow. So air comes from the top. So that means that sometimes you'll see flame tips curling down like this, which is really interesting. And it really helps keep all the smoke from leaving the hot zone so it burns. So I've been doing some experimenting and design work on what I call the ring of fire kiln. Adding this heat shield makes a huge difference. It improves the efficiency, so I can make more biochar in less time. And it seems to be very clean. Here's a diagram I've made showing how the ring of fire kiln works. So the heat shield, in addition to holding in heat, it preheats some of the combustion air that comes up through the annular gap. And so that helps with the efficiency of the kiln. And here you can see in this picture how a little bit of smoke sticking up out of the kiln, of the stick sticking up out of the kiln that's smoking, the airflows actually draw the smoke into the kiln and burn it. I'm offering these for sale now for about 1.5 years. I've sold nearly 100 of these. And so I've got inventory. If you want one, let me know. So I'm taking now a lot of different work from different people and looking at, what's most suitable for using in a forestry context. So it has to be mobile. So I've divided these into 3 basic categories of forestry kilns. And that would be small bin kilns, large bin kilns, and panel kilns that are expandable. And it's really about mobility. Small bin kilns can be moved by a hand crew. Larger bin kilns are going to be road-based. They can also handle bigger feedstock because there's more heat. And then panel kilns are expandable and can be adaptable to either technique of feeding material. The main difference between a panel kiln and a bin kiln is that it doesn't have a bottom. So you have to open it up and spray and rake to quench, whereas a bin kiln can be flood quenched. Here's an example of a small bin kiln. We call this the Oregon kiln, developed by the Umpqua Biochar education team in Oregon. It makes about a cubic yard of biochar in 4 hours. Here's our first big forestry project that we tried. We had 166 cubic yards of forest slash, and we sequestered 7 tons of CO2 from our 3 days of work. Here's an example of a large bin kiln. Brandon Barron in Burns, Oregon, cut this 10,000 gallon water tank in half and made a kiln out of it. And again, you can see this curly flame tip curling down. And this is how the small panel kiln works in operation. You load it, you light it, you load it again, keep loading it for several hours. And at the end of the day, you open it up and pull out your char. And this is an example of the expandable. This is a 5-panel version of that. I'm not going to talk a lot about air curtain burners. Jim Archuleta, who's speaking later, we'll talk about that a little bit. And these are designed for incineration. They use a blower. Other than that, it's really a similar concept to the flame cap kiln. And various groups have been working on modifications of these devices to make biochar. So what do you need for a small kiln? You need to look at feedstock prep and how you're going to prepare and stack your feedstock, how to get the feedstock moved to where the kilns are, because you're drawing from a little bit of an area to, you know, feed one of these kilns. It'll use quite a bit of material. And then what are your quenching options? You know, if you're in the wooey in someone's backyard, a garden hose, otherwise, you know, a water truck or 5-gallon backpack pumps. And what about a large kiln? For that, you're going to need probably more of a yarding system, because you'll be doing this on a roadside or a landing. What kind of, how are you going to load it with machinery? And then again, your quenching needs. So looking at this whole problem of biochar in the woods and your different technology options, we could look at it as kind of a matrix where we have a combination of site conditions and technology options that we need to match. So, you know, we've got topography, we've got the amount of fuel on the landscape, we've got the size of the fuel. Is it small or large? Is it dry or wet? So how do we match these things up when we're planning a job? So we could put together a kind of decision tree where you can match them. So take topography, for instance. If you have a very steep slope and you have a lot of fuel, heavy fuel loading, you're probably going to look at conservation burn technology, because it's going to be difficult to get kilns out there. There's a lot of material, and it's going to be most cost effective to use the conservation burn. If you have less of a slope and still heavy fuel, and your fuel size is small and it's dry, then you might look at the small bin kilns, because you'll make more biochar with a small bin kiln than you will in a conservation burn. Now, if you have wet fuel and large size fuel, you might want to go with the air burner, because it can handle a moist fuel. And if it's somewhere in between, then maybe the big bin kiln would be the appropriate one. So that's just a first cut at how to think about planning a biochar in the woods job. And then we need to look, of course, at costs and outputs. So, you know, in this scheme here, you've got the conservation burn in the small kiln that can be operated by hand crews. So this is low equipment costs, low mobilization costs, but medium to high labor costs. In this case with the kiln, you're going to have high biochar production efficiency. Then you have the mechanized operations here that are going to be more expensive in terms of equipment and less expensive in terms of labor. You know, some will make a lot of biochar, some will make less. And so, you know, this all has to be weighed in terms of what resources you have available to do the job. I want to just say a word though about labor versus equipment. Some of this equipment could be really expensive, like the air curtain burner. And labor again is expensive, but what are we spending our money on and what are we getting for it? You know, just want to advocate for doing this work by hand, because it's complex work, as President Roosevelt said back in the 30s when he was creating the Civilian Conservation Corps. I proposed to create the CCC to be used in complex work in forestry, prevention of soil erosion, flood control, etc. So this is handwork. This can't be done by a machine. Machines can't plant trees. Machines can't do a lot of the soil and forest restoration work that needs to be done. This is handwork that requires human judgment and a human touch on the land. So, you know, there are really good reasons for doing a lot of these projects by hand. There are also really good social benefits that could result from creating and funding a carbon conservation corps, or climate conservation corps. You know, you get young people out in the woods doing healthy work, doing meaningful work, protecting their communities from wildfire, and sequestering carbon. You know, if I were a young person right now looking at the future, I'd be pretty concerned, and I would be looking for a place to put my efforts that would actually do something about climate change. So this is something that we can do. And one of the things that I love about biochar is it's so easy to measure what you're doing. So you just need to know how much biochar you made. For instance, in the ring of fire kiln, you just need to get the height and of the char in the kiln, and by geometry, you can figure out how much you made. And if we make a few simple assumptions about bulk density and carbon content, we come to a rule of thumb that says 1 ton of biochar is equal to 2.5 tons of sequestered carbon, so that 10 yards of biochar is a ton. And, finally, as my friend Kathleen Draper likes to say, biochar is shovel ready and measurable. So it's straightforward, and it should be something that we can get behind. Here are some of the knowledge gaps that I see that we need to address to really scale this up. We need some more pilot projects with good data collection to really establish the costs and benefits so people know what we're really talking about. We need to do some emissions testing to help air quality regulators understand the benefits of doing flame carbonization versus standard pile burning or other options. We're going to need some advocacy and funding to establish these programs. We also need to help small landowners and communities share and obtain resources for this, because a lot of people are doing this on their own land now. And then finally, we're going to need training programs for the workers who are doing the work. And as a way to advance all this, because this is also new and we're still developing techniques, but at this point we have learned a lot, we need to put it all in a document. We need to put it all in one place so that land managers and policymakers can understand what it is we're doing. And so that, when we're training workforce, we have, know what to talk about. And so here's all the topics that are going to go into, hopefully, a general technical report for the U.S. Forest Service that will help guide agencies and land managers in implementing the techniques. And as part of that, a lot of people are contributing to that. And we have a Biochar in the Woods discussion forum. So if you'd like to join us, I think we have the information for that in the chat, or we'll get you that information about how to join that forum. And finally, I'd like to really thank all the people that have been working with me over the last decade or so to develop the techniques, to test them in the woods, to do workshops and share. A lot of different agencies, the NRCS, the Forest Service, Sonoma Biochar Initiative, so many, I can't really name them all here. And, just people who own woods, who care about the forests and are moving these techniques forward. So luckily, we're going to hear from a lot of them today. So that's what I'm really excited about, that you will get to hear from some of the people who've been making this happen. So just briefly going to go over the presenters this morning. After I'm done here, we'll hear from Carlos Rodriguez Franco, Senior Forester, USDA Forest Service. And then we'll hear quite a bit from Deb Dumroese, USDA Forest Service Research Soil Scientist, about how she's been researching ways to improve forest soils with biochar. And then we'll hear from two managers of two larger on-the-ground projects, Karen Youngblood from the Redwood Forest Foundation and Kai Hoffman-Krull from San Juan Islands Conservation District. So they're working with Conservation Corps groups right now. So that's the morning. After lunch, we have Lori Schoenhoven from NRCS, National Forester, to talk about those NRCS programs that support biochar. So there's funding available now from the NRCS to do this. Then we'll hear from Ken Carloni of the U Creek Land Alliance about his experience implementing one of those NRCS programs. And then we'll hear from Joe Pongratz and Dan Hansen, who are forestry contractors who've been implementing biochar projects. And then at the end of that session, we'll hear from Mark Vandermeer with Watershed Consulting about a large project he's just completed in Montana. Then the second afternoon session is starts with Abby Kohlauer talking about the Long Tom Restoration Council and their ecological monitoring of biochar. Gloria Flora then from Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, talking about permaculture and the Fire Ecology Restoration Project. And then Dylan Maxwell from Carbon Face. This is going to be a little really interesting about how he's developing a platform to help support small biochar projects. And then finally, the last session, we'll start with Ken Carille again to talk about how he's been trying to measure production efficiencies and how that applies to kiln design. We'll hear from Darren McAvoy from Utah State about his experience designing big box biochar kilns and using them. Then Raymond Baltar from the Sonoma Biochar Initiative is going to talk about the really important topic of measuring emissions. And then finally, Jim Archuleta from US Forest Service, who's been doing biochar for a very long time in the woods, will talk about air curtain burners and landing piles. We'll wrap it up then, and then after that, we'll stick around for an hour. I'll be here anyway. If anybody wants to hang out, we'll open up the forum to everyone and do a little shop talk. All right, so thank you again, everyone, for being here. It's going to be a great day, and so settle in with your coffee and whatnot. And I'm going to turn this back over to Carol right now to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Kelpie. So I'm going to introduce Deborah Page Dumroese, and she's going to tell us a little bit about opportunities to improve soil health. Deborah is a senior scientist and a research soil scientist at the USFS Rocky Mountain Research Station in Moscow, Idaho. She has been involved in assessing the long-term productivity of forest soils for many years and has worked on sustaining forest growth after harvesting and site preparation. Deborah has worked for the past decade on minimizing the impacts of slash pile burning while finding a better use for unmerchantable logging residues. And this led to using biochar to improve forest, range, and abandoned mine soils around the Western US. Debbie has a dozen diverse field sites where biochar application is used to restore soil and hydrologic function. She studies biochar impacts, biomass utilization, nutrient cycling, long-term productivity, organic matter, and how temperature and moisture regulate decomposition processes. And with that, Deborah, I will turn this over to you.
All right, so let's see. I'm going to get what I really wanted to do today, though, is give you some examples of where biochar could be used and some of the responses that we get when we put biochar out on soil, and then what those benefits might be. And so if you fall asleep during this presentation, this is what I want the take-home message to be, that in the center is healthy soil, right? That's really what we're after. But all of the pieces that put that together are that we do sustainable harvesting, that part of what we do is to leave some woody residue behind for long-term organic matter inputs. That includes biochar, but it also fresh woody residues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are opportunities to convert excess biomass to biochar, and then we'll put that biochar on a site. But what I really want you to remember today is that on forest soils, sometimes it takes a long time to get responses. It's not like oftentimes you hear about in agriculture, we put out biochar the first year, and then the next year we have this huge increase in productivity and we see the crops respond. Forest ecosystems are a lot slower. And so, I want to caution you all that patience, we got to have patience for all this work. And so, the way I see it, there's 3 threats to soil health. One is just the overall forest health decline from climate change. We have insects and diseases, drought, and wildfire. The second one that Kelpie touched on was this pile burning. Sometimes the scars are huge and they can last for, we've got data that shows these pile burn scars could last for up to 5 decades. And so with that, we have a burn scar that has no trees growing in it. And so we've lost that productivity. And the third one, of course, is this loss of organic matter. Some of that is due to climate change. Some of that's due to how we treat the soil. Oftentimes there's erosion, no vegetation, in some cases like burn scars. We end up with low infiltration rates and low water storage. So I want to dive into these just a little bit deeper. You all know this threat to forest health. We have longer and more severe wildfire seasons, an increase in insects and diseases and drought. We have overstocked stands that are really trying to, from the Forest Service point of view, really trying to get a handle on and treat these stands. But part of the problem with treating these stands is that we often don't have bioenergy markets that could take advantage of this small diameter material that really doesn't have much of a value. And so, we build piles, as Kelpie showed in her presentation. And there's also, a lot of places that are close to urban areas. There's limited acceptance of prescribed fires because of the smoke and particulate impacts. And so, part of this whole work and what Kelpie really showed was that, private landowners need some options for what do we do with this material? And so the second threat, I also have a picture of burn scars like Kelpie did. Mine's a little higher elevation view, but you can see in this picture on the left, all the little white dimples on the landscape. And those little dimples are 50-year-old burn scars. And so this legacy of burning is still impacting our landscapes today. And they're often great places to grow invasive species if that's what you really want to grow. That's not what we're trying to do. And so, the conservation burn idea that Kelpie talked about is one way to treat that slash and not have such a large impact on the soil. And then the third threat is this loss of organic matter. It's invasive species. We often have soils that are compacted, low infiltration, erosion. I'm going to highlight some of that work in some of the examples that I show in a little bit. And so, what is soil health? There's a lot, and maybe when Lori from the NRCS talks later today, she's going to talk about what soil health might be. But when I boil it all down, one of the keys to maintaining soil health across a lot of ecosystems is maintaining soil organic matter content. And so, biochar is a great way to increase that soil organic matter content, so we can then improve soil health to produce the goods and services that we want from ecosystems. So forest soils, like I said earlier, they're a slower rate of change, but adding biochar can help improve those soil properties. And really, the goal of all of this work is that we have healthy wildland soils that can produce healthy forage for wildlife or for cattle. We can improve the health of wildlife and livestock. We're providing healthy forests and ranges that are really more resilient to those threats that I talked about earlier, the forest health, the low value wood, the loss of organic matter. What we really want are ecosystems that, with the changes in ecosystem properties like temperature and moisture, are really more resilient to those changes. So what does it take? It means we can add organic matter. And, here I've got this triangle that talks about, some of the basic soil properties like just soil biology, aggregate stability, infiltration. And then up in the triangle, the next one is soil functions like nutrient cycling and water holding capacity. And then finally, air quality, water quality, all of those things are driven by organic matter. And so, if you have an agricultural field, it's easy to put organic matter out, right? You can use compost and manure, cover crops. That's really hard to do in a wildland soil. You don't really do that in forests very much. And so, making biochar in woods or wood chips or biosolids, those are things that we can use at a larger scale in forest ecosystems. But part of that is just maintaining the surface organic horizons to help with nutrient cycling and maintaining soil productivity. All of those things are connected, and how we treat the soil really reflects how resilient our ecosystem will be. And so, I do want to make a point. Sometimes it's not just about biochar, even though this is all about biochar today. But some of what we do is just leaving some of those harvest residues behind. They also supply carbon, but I would say that on sites that are low in nutrients for one reason or another, maybe a lot of them are just, that's how they've weathered over time, and they're just, a lot of soils here in North Idaho are low in potassium. But leaving residues behind like needles and twigs, that's a great way to get those nutrients leached back into the soil before creating biochar. So, the timing of when you think about creating biochar could be one aspect of the work. And leaving large logs behind. That's also key for biodiversity. Salamanders, squirrels, truffles, whatever you like. Those large logs are really key, and over time they become part of the soil and are really important for water holding capacity, as much as biochar is. And as Kelpie mentioned, burning smaller slash piles might be one way to create charcoal within the forest ecosystem. And so the problem has always been too much biomass, and we burn it in slash piles, right? It's difficult to handle, nobody wants it, it's hard to transport, and it costs a lot. And so, so as Kelpie pointed out, we have some options, and I have some options too, and kind of a pick your way you want to be able to treat these low value woody residues. There's more than this, right? But for today, we'll just focus on these two. And one, as I mentioned, was to leave the wood on the soil. And you can slowly build carbon over time. It's not, it's not a decade. It's probably 4 or 5 decades, 100 years in some ecosystems to get that soil moved, that wood moved into the soil. And then the other option is to make local biochar. And you can leave the biochar, if for whatever reason you might have way too much biochar than you wanted to add to your forest site, you might consider then redistributing that within a watershed. Maybe there's some local agricultural land that you could use it on, or an area that you just that is overgrazed and you want to build up grazing potential on this rangeland. There's a lot of options that you could think about, but again, it's those transportation costs. You're not going to be moving it great distances and still be able to make any money on it, or have anybody who would want to buy it, unless they're helping you pay for that transportation costs. And so, one of the bonuses is that we now have the tools to make biochar on site. It's relatively high in carbon. It will last decades to centuries, and it can improve physical, chemical, and biological properties. And it's one of those things that it's really a nice way to kind of address all of those issues that you might have with your soil. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the benefits that we might get to improve degraded soil. So physical properties. Certainly biochar can alter the pore size distribution and total porosity within the soil profile. It decreases soil bulk density, which is great if you've got a compacted skid trail or a log landing. It's a refugia for beneficial microorganisms. We've had biochar out on forest sites, and right underneath the organic layer that has biochar in it, just millions and millions of fungal mycelia are located there on those plots. But maybe the biggest benefit is this increase in water holding capacity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in this slide. We really think about putting biochar on a site to build back that soil sponge, the holding water in the soil profile. You can decrease overland flow and increase infiltration, and you can maintain that water longer in the soil profile. So you can keep vegetation green longer into the growing season, and maybe it's less likely to spark a wildfire there. And so there have been several studies that have looked at available water based on soil texture. And, we've always known that coarse textured soils respond best to biochar, but even fine textured soils, we could increase water holding capacity 16%. And that could be huge in some areas, but a 38% increase, some studies have shown even higher water holding capacity increases after biochar is added. So, you know, I do have to caution you, you have to keep in mind that it's all about what kind of soil do you have, how much organic matter do you have, what's the texture, you know, knowing those things can help you think about what the benefits are, or, you know, what benefits you might be able to expect as time goes on. And soil chemistry. We know that biochar can increase nutrient retention and reduce leaching. So if you know, biochar is added to agricultural soils or pastures, maybe that means that there's less leaching of nutrients into groundwater, into local streams. We've seen increases in soil calcium and magnesium and carbon for sure. Not so much with total nitrogen or phosphorus or magnesium, but you know, I think it depends on the biochar and the soils. This also means that this increased retention over time, the biochar releases those nutrients and can be taken up by the roots of the plants that are growing there. But maybe one key is that biochar often is alkaline, and so it could increase soil pH if that's a goal of your management. And that means then if you might not have to apply lime as amendment to your soil. And then biology. Like I said, we've seen that biochar can increase biological properties, in some cases reduce greenhouse gas emissions and soil respiration. It can increase nitrogen availability and change the rate of decomposition below ground. And I'm going to talk about that decomposition piece in another slide that's coming up pretty soon. So I'll keep you listening along so you can hear all the news. And so one of the other things that we found, and I show this paper here at the bottom of the slide, they've also found that you know, biochar could be used to reduce the number of invasive species that come back on a site. This was just a happenstance that we found this. We hadn't really think about invasive species in biochar, but and an example that I'll show later, I'll talk more about this, but we found that we had fewer invasive species coming into areas that we had put out biochar on. Or another option is to use invasive species like Russian olive or gorse or Scotch broom as the feedstock for your biochar, and you can get rid of your invasive species that way. You know, so lots of options when it comes to making and using biochar for different management ideas. So here's a quick summary. You know, this doesn't capture everything, but in general, biochar is, we know biochar is great for carbon sequestration and available water increases. The greenhouse gas fluxes, some are positive, some are negative. It just depends on the soil and the climate. We've seen increases in soil biology, decreased water and wind erosion and nutrient leaching. And I put arrows going both directions for this vegetative productivity. I'm going to show you an example here in a minute. You'll see why. We don't often see changes in forest growth based on biochar application. And you know, we kind of scratch our head about that. Other places have seen it. And so I do think that species, climate, and age of the trees really makes a difference in what responses we see. And so now this is the best part, I think. This is the examples of how you could use biochar, where it might be appropriate, and just to give you some ideas of you know, some options. Right. So here's an example from the Bitterroot National Forest. This was site now is over a decade old, and I know you can't see this graph very well, but we did alter soil moisture content from the control soil to the areas that had about 10 tons per acre of biochar. This is like 1 year, this graph is from 2 years after application at 10 centimeters. We've tracked this now for about 5 years and saw that this shift in soil moisture continued to grow as the biochar worked its way into the mineral soil. So like I said earlier, it does take time. It's not a fast process. We found that the understory stayed green longer, but you can see in this slide, there was no significant difference after 10 years in the ponderosa pine height growth. And, you know, and we were, you know, we had been expecting big things, right? And it's interesting because we've changed water holding capacity, but even 10 years after the site installation, you still have not seen any. If you use your imagination and squint your eyes, you could say, oh yeah, kind of a little bit more in some of those treatments, but overall, it's not statistically significant. But what I really want to talk to you about is decomposition processes in the mineral soil. And so I want to draw your attention to a couple things. The first are the green bars. And the green bars are the fertilizer treatment on this site. And, it's 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And the response is rapid, right? You can see it in 2011, 2012, and then you don't see it so much. It kind of tapers off a little bit in terms of the decomposition processes. The microorganisms aren't using that nitrogen any longer, so it's either gone or it's leached from the profile. The next one I want you to look at is not coming up. Oh, there it goes. Okay. The next one I want you to look at is the red bars, and that's the wood chip. So it was masticated wood that was applied to the soil surface, and at about a rate of 50 tons per acre. And you can see it took about 3 years for that to happen, right? It's 2013. We finally see that those wood chips are making a difference. So they also have changed soil moisture holding capacity. They're kind of a mulch on the soil surface. And then, there's still pretty high decomposition in 2014. By 2015, that's changed. And then here's the biochar application, the 10 tons per acre of biochar. It takes 5 years for us to really see that boost in microbial decay in the mineral soil. And so, when I said earlier that you have to have patience, it's really true that this work takes time, and the responses that you see will take time as well. And one of the things that we've often wondered is, does this change in soil moisture really affect insects and diseases and overall tree health? And those are some things. Kelpie mentioned that there's still work to do on the kilns. There's also still some work to do on what responses we see on ecosystems. So here's another example from the Helena National Forest. This is eastern Montana. We did some road obliteration work, and the treatments were wood strands. You can see those here in the foreground, and then biochar at a couple of rates. One of the things that we did on this site was to mix the biochar in. We really wanted to see that reduction in bulk density. And so as they were obliterating the road, we mixed the biochar into the mineral soil. We reduced the bulk density in the top 30 inches of the soil, and that reduced bulk density has stayed reduced for the last, I think it's been 9 years. This is the site that we saw that reduced or delayed invasive species coming into this obliterated area. We know we brought up probably some weed seeds from below, but we had very few invasive species on the biochar plots as compared to the wood strand and the do nothing treatment. So that was a bonus. And then, of course, it's this long-term carbon input that you've got in the mineral soil. And you'll see in the next couple of examples that most of the work has been in altering soil physical properties in different ways. So here's another example, 3 national forests in the Midwest, where they were doing some log landing restoration to support pollinator plants and insects. And the goal was really reduce the bulk density of these stands and add biochar, and they were seeding pollinator plants. And so this study just got started last year, and so we don't have a lot of results, except that we are seeing the benefits of biochar in terms of the number of plants coming back on the plots. And so here's another example of improving soil physical properties so that you can reduce erosion. This is the Umpqua National Forest. This is some work that Jim Archuleta had done with his group on the Umpqua when he was there. We know that the biochar alone or mixed with compost or biosolids or wood chips is really a great way to get organic matter established, and seeding local species is really key. So the goal is to get vegetative cover so we can reduce erosion. Once those roots start to move through the soil that also helps keep the bulk density reduced, and you're adding organic matter that can also help, all those processes that reduce the compaction and build aggregate stability, all those things that we want as part of soil health. And so another example, they just never end, right? So the Stanislaus National Forest, this was a salvage logging operation done in California. And we took the log trees, turned them into biochar, put them back out. These are, this example is the largest plots we've ever installed. They're 1 acre in size. Part of the work is looking at insects and vegetation, those microbial processes and the nutrient flux changes. This was close to a wildland urban interface. And so we really wanted something that, would be acceptable to the people who are living at that interface. And, so far we've seen that the below ground processes have been somewhat altered. I mean, the biggest change really has been in water holding capacity. And it really, that's been the big bonus. This site is just pretty new. It's only about 2 or 3 years old. A lot of the biochar that you can see on the surface here in this picture hasn't quite worked its way all the way into the mineral soil yet. And it's just, we're just beginning to be able to pick it up in the mineral soil. So patience, right? Here's another example. This is the Caribou-Targhee National Forest in southern Idaho. They're trying to restore rangeland vegetation. And this area had been near a spring. And really what they were trying to do was to get vegetative cover on the site. Had been overgrazed and improve water quality as the water moved to the spring. And so this is brand new. This was just put in this last winter. So all I have is a shot of biochar on the soil that you can see in the background here. But we're tracking water movement through the soil and the nutrients that water is moving through, and then track that as it moves towards the spring to see if we can improve vegetative cover and water quality at the same time. And this next example is salvage logging on the Mount Hood National Forest. The Mount Hood National Forest had used this carbonator to make biochar, and they were pretty successful. And so a lot of biochar was made. And so this biochar, I think, went to mineland restoration. And so that's another option for if you've got great gobs of biochar and you've got a lot, Forest Service, the BLM, there's a lot of abandoned minelands that are really in need of restoration. And so this is a key focus of a lot of the work that I've been working on is, how can we use this to reduce the amount of harmful chemicals that are moving through the soil or attached to soil particles and moving downstream. But certainly, you could use it for grapes or in feedlots or mixed with compost and use it in community gardens or other places. And so here's my latest example is the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, and they've been working to restore vegetation after wildfire. And I think we're all familiar with that. And so the goal here was to just get some vegetation established to reduce erosion on severely burned areas. And you can see the biochar plot is in red here. It was seeded behind it and on either side, and where we have the green vegetation is where we have the biochar. I think part of this conversation about restoring vegetation also has to be about what native species are best, and should it be a surface application, or should we think about raking, kind of like our road obliteration or log landing of bulk density reduction. What's the best way to apply it to get those ecosystem benefits that we want in a short time, and and where should we be looking to get those benefits? And so, here's kind of the summary. It's the boosting nutrient storage. We can enhance soil structure, and it's a great carbon source for carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change. I think now as we think about, that we don't often have a large snowpack and a lot of our precipitation is coming as rain in higher elevations, maybe this is a way to improve ecosystem water storage and to clean water before it moves into reservoirs or rivers. We've seen that it could be really beneficial at detoxifying soil contaminants, brownfields. We've done some work with mercury. It's a great way to just get vegetation on these abandoned mine sites that really have no vegetation growing right now. So, it's a productivity thing. And of course, decreased compaction. And, there's probably a lot more benefits that we don't have time for today, right? And so I just want to leave you with this reminder that, every soil is different. It's the soil type. We've seen the biggest response on is coarse textured, low organic matter soils, but even fine textured soils have a good biochar response. The responses in forest or wildland soil ecosystems are slower than you would see in agricultural soils. There's no doubt about it. But I think if we just think about this increasing water storage, the carbon sequestration piece, and the increase in ecosystem resilience, I think that's where we can really see the benefits of all of this work that we're trying to do. Small scale, large scale. I think every tool in the toolbox has to be deployed. And so I want to end there. Make sure that Carlos has time to speak at the end. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you being here.
So as Kelpie said, Carlos Rodriguez Franco is going to be our next speaker, and he's going to talk on Forest Service programs that support biochar. Carlos received his doctorate in forest sciences from Yale University with a specialty in silviculture, and currently he works with the Forest Service as a senior forester. He's the former deputy chief for research and development, and before that, he worked for the USDA Agricultural Research Service in charge of the research collaboration with Latin America and Canada. Now, in Mexico, he worked for the National Institute of Forestry, Agriculture, and Animal Husbandry Research for 25 years. He was the former Forestry Research General Director there, and he has published widely in many related fields, and his current research interests are related to forest management for climate change adaptation in forest ecosystems, impacts of extreme climate events on forest ecosystems, wildland fire, and research topics about forest inventories, silviculture, plant production techniques, forest plantations, and agroforestry systems and forest products industry. So with that, I will turn that over to Carlos.
So I will try to be brief. I'm going to speak about what Forest Service is working on biochar. We started to, can you go to the next? We started almost 2 years ago about working on biochar. And most of the reasons are because we have overstocked forest stands, not only in the West, all over the country. This is giving us a lot of trouble about competition and susceptibility for diseases and attack of insects and high mortality rates because of the competition and the droughts. So we have to do something about it, because otherwise we will continue having these catastrophic wildland fires in big amounts of forest land. So if we go to the next one, we can see that working on trying to decrease the impacts of climate change, we can be able to have healthy forests. Can you go to the next one? But also at the same time, we can also create jobs, restore the environmental conditions, continue having ecosystem services, and use these forest residues that we left after some silvicultural interventions, but also to use small diameter trees with low quality to manage forest stands and decrease the density and give more space for the remaining growing trees. Doing this, we can use the different logging residues, the food treatments, the dead trees by insects and diseases, and the meal residues in putting to work into biochar. And the next one, please. So Forest Service is trying to do something about it, decreasing the risk of catastrophic fires, support forest management to restore our forest stands to healthy conditions, reducing the impacts of drought and climate change, improve environmental conditions, decreasing the risk of fire for rural communities, which is a big worry given the recent events that we have lost not only the forest resources, but many, many homes and buildings, and is impacting our rural communities. But at the same time, trying to recover jobs and coming back to a healthy economy. One way to do this is increasing the forest management of our national forests. Just the chief announced with the Secretary Vilsack this wildland fire strategy initiative for wildland fire management. And he also has been speaking about using more biomass. So if we use more biomass, we can create and develop the markets for biochar and also increase carbon sequestration in agricultural lands and forest lands, as you saw with the great presentation from Debbie a few moments ago, what we can do and promote economic development for forest-dependent rural communities. The next one, please. So biochar markets, based on studies done by the US Biochar Initiative and Dovetail, shows reports that biochar production is between 50,000 to 100,000 tons per year. We have 128 until the time of the report in 2018, 128 producers and suppliers. The United States is the bigger producer of biochar in North America. China is by far a bigger producer than us in biochar. Estimated 80% of commercial products made 20% of the suppliers. The estimated amount of green tons is 225,000 green tons. And prices are vary heavily depending where you buy it and also the amount of biochar that you buy. But it's available in many, many places to buy it. And the number of producers is increasing. Next one, please. Biochar, according to several reports and studies, have shown that can be used up to 55 new uses. Right now, we have been mostly working in agronomy related issues to increase water retention, crop productivity, plant nutrients, increase organic matter, and also to sequester or decrease heavy metals and restoring abandoned mine lands on highly polluted land sites. But it also can be used for fuel and gasification and co-firing and combustion. Carbon credit is taking a lot of interest right now, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. And also can be used for specialty materials in biocomposites, fuel cells, photovoltaics, and other uses as superconductors that people is researching right now, and in biomedical uses and in chemical uses. All this is coming to be very exciting into the future of biochar and the interest of using a different kind of feedstocks to produce it. But forest biomass has a big advantage in many cases because the abundance, relatively cheap to obtain, and also because the advantage of having different characteristics like not having high amount of pollutants or contaminants like, for example, waste biomass from animal waste, for example. Next, please. So a group of scientists and practitioners and forest managers in Forest Service, we got together in the Forest Products Lab at the beginning of 2019 to develop this strategy based in five more main activities. One is education, technical assistance, pilot initiatives, special initiatives, and research work. And I'm going to touch in each one very briefly. Next, please. For the last 2 years, we have had webinars, monthly webinars. The attendance per webinar changed a lot, but it's mostly in average 450 people. We have given close to 20. We are continuing this February to speak about the biochar atlas in agricultural crops, the use of biochar. And we have touched around 10,000 people, although I can say some of them are repeated in this, but it's the amount of people that have covered our webinars. Next, please. We work in this in partnership with the USBI, with Tom Miles and his team. Technical assistance, we have been doing demonstrations, trying to test the charbos. Jim Archuleta and Debbie and Tom Miles have been heavily involved on this. Forest Service has a patent for this device, together with air burners, and they are working in improving this technology. And we are going to continue having these demonstrations very soon. Next one, please. Also, Forest Service has a patent for a biochar spreader that you can use when you want to spread biochar high quantities to recover forest soils. Something that we have been trying to work is there are hundreds of thousands of abandoned mine lands in the West, and also a lot of oil wells in the country that can be restored to provide ecosystem services using biochar. Right now, we have in different regions of the Forest Service a proposal to develop between 9 and 12 pilots on restoration of abandoned mine lands to recover ecosystem services, recover the soil, and also to sequester heavy pollutants. We hope to get funding to the infrastructure bill to do these pilots this year. We are just waiting for the funding to start with. Some of these studies, Forest Service has been doing these activities for a long time, more than 10 years, trying to test different amounts of biochar, different characteristics of biochars to see what are the main ones to revegetate the place, increase organic matter, soil production, water retention, and all the benefits associated with biochar, at least trying also to decrease the spread of pollutants through wind or through water streams. Next, please. So this is the list, one example of the list that we want to work with. These are located in different areas of the United States and with different interests. Something that Debbie is trying to work with is to use biochar to reduce erosion created by asbestos, and also to decrease the circulation of asbestos in the air, just trying to capture them using biochar in degraded soils. We hope to get this on soon, because up to now we know there has not been a better way to recover these areas where asbestos have been mined. Next, please. So in the special initiatives, we try to get together to work with as much partners as we can. We recently got last year a memorandum of understanding signed with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment, to work together in recovering mine lands. We are going to start this year in the Tongas, in Prince Wales Island, to work in recovering one mine using funding from the Superfund that APA has for this. And But what we want to do in research, for example, is besides characterizing the places where we are doing restoration work, also we want to see the amounts of biochar that we are going to apply, test that, also apply different kind of biochars with different specifications coming from different species to see what are the best ones to be using, and what amounts, what intensity, how many times we have to do applications, what kind of forest species can grow after several applications, and how we can start to monitor the changes in soil properties. So this is also research and long-term that we want to see. And also to start to monitor what are the effects on water and air and other characteristics. We work with the US Biochar Initiative. We are trying to engage with the International Biochar Initiative as much as we can. We are talking to the US Endowment for Forestry communities to work with us in restoration of abandoned mine lands producing biochar. We work with ARS and RCS, Rural Development, the Climate Change Hubs, BLM, and with many, many universities. Forest Service alone don't have the capacity with all the expertise that we need to have. So that's why we do these strategic alliances. So next one, please. And also we are trying to engage the industry. In what is worth about research, we have a team of people working in assessments, how much biomass we can have available for produce, where are the strategic places where we can intervene to decrease the risk of catastrophic fire and produce biochar, where is the industry located and the connections where we can get to engage those places, trying to be specific in about the design of a forest management innovations like the establishment of something called biomass utilization campuses. Others are called industrial clusters, and also they are known as a biohubs, where you can get different industries using different kind of raw material, but what you do is trying to decrease the footprint of transportation, the carbon emissions, decrease the cost of transportation, having access to different kinds of highways, train, or other methods to transport not only the raw materials, but also the final products, and also being smart in how you can use almost 100% of the raw material for different applications. We are trying to develop tech transfer actions through the demonstrations that like the ones that are planned for this workshop, working with ARS, trying to develop biochar coming from the forest to the farm to increase agricultural soils productivity and see the effects in crop harvest in the long term, and as well as other activities that we do like are related to life cycle analysis and techno-economic studies that, for example, Nate Anderson or Kalaman Kantasahu are conducting together with Dan McCullough. So we have a very good team of experts, not many, but very good ones working on developing the biochar. And also the Forest Products Lab, besides its markets unit, also has a group of scientists trying to develop new uses for biochar and also working in carbon estimates developed by biochar. Next one, please. State and private forestry has this program of Wood Innovations Grants program funding. They have this new one, Community Wood Facilities Grant Funding. This is, they are working right now in selecting the projects that are going to be funded this year. And they do significant investments in partnerships. Right now, for the last 6-7 years, we have more than 25 grant program funding projects developing or trying to support the development of the biochar industry. Next one. So talking about future needs, I think we have to continue developing standards to be able to have more states approving the use of biochar for different uses, not only for soil productivity or restoration of degraded areas, but also for new applications like feeding of animals, of cattle. Yesterday, there was a very nice webinar about that and where we are. We need to educate more the public. This is something that we need to really work with, because given the different benefits of sequestering carbon in the soil as a biochar, instead of going into emissions, is a big deal at this moment, and biochar can be part of the solution in a big way. If we start to use, for example, in gardening, biochar, it will be something really great. Just to give you an idea, there are 44 million acres of domestic grass in all the urban areas of the United States. If you use biochar, you see the potential in that area. Also, to start to be used in other areas in urban settlements to recover highly polluted areas that we need to convert into better places. We need to work in future policy development and the use of biochar for the long term. It could be a good solution for food security as part of the national strategy, because when we use biochar, we can decrease the use of water to grow crops because we increase the water retention. And we need to work in best management practices for different kind of applications. The next one, I think, is the last one. I just want to mention that all the work that we have been doing is not only from my side. We have the wood innovator coordinators from the Forest Service, very enthusiastic support from Jim Archuleta, Brian Bradshaw, Debbie, the group of scientists that I mentioned their name, Julie Tucker. The next one, plus a big group of people working in the field, trying to develop these applications for biochar. Thank you. I think it's all.
Thank you, Carlos. That was exciting. Really fantastic to see the huge array of things that the Forest Service is doing. And we've really enjoyed, the webinar program that you've had. And so that's terrific.
Can I say something that I forgot is important?
Yes.
In the infrastructure bill, there is a specific amount of money that is mentioned for is $100 million for 5 years to develop biochar applications, biochar industry, and for ecosystem restoration. And that's part of the pilots that we were talking about, plus other investments that Forest Service is planning to do with that money. And they are, the people that is doing this is working right now in the investments for the next 5 years. That's all. Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to move into Q&A now. We have about 12 minutes for that, 13 minutes. So there's a lot of questions. I'm going to start with a couple that were directed towards me. And so here's a question from Robert. Is it possible to add fuel to an active conservation burn to increase volume? So yes, in fact, that's a technique that's been used for a long time. We call it a swamper burn. And you get a hot fire going and you keep adding material to it. And so if you manage it correctly, you can increase the amount of char that you make. So it's So the answer to that is yes. Also, Jeff asked, could you use snow for quenching with winter piles instead? And yes, I have seen some examples of that. I've done it myself. You know, if it's cold enough and you've got a little snow, you don't need water at all. You can just mix the snow, rake it thin. So, you know, that is definitely a possibility in areas where you have winter snow. Rachel asked, could the conservation burn techniques be more incorporated in commercial fuels treatments? And that's really what we're trying to do is, I'm not sure what you mean by commercial fuels treatments, I guess. So, but we want to make this a part of regular practice in all areas of forestry. And then Karen asks, is there a ratio between fuel diameter and required temperature in order to char? Often we find char on outer surfaces, but inner wood is still brown. You know, a lot of times when we put a mix of sizes in a conservation burn or a kiln, some of the bigger pieces will not char all the way through and they'll have char on the outside. And it's really not a problem because we can either just, you know, toss that back out on the landscape or we can put it in the next kiln burn. And then Todd asked, does it take a lot of 5-gallon backpacks to quench? An issue if you're hiking in away from the road? Yes, you know, 5-gallon backpacks is not the most ideal way, but I think we'll hear from Kai Hoffman-Krull later about his experience. So let's listen to what he has to say about that. Karen has a question about insurance for Conservation Corps crews, young people. And so we're going to address that later. Raymond Baltar is going to talk about that. And yes, if you're running a forestry crew, you have to be well organized and you have to have all your ducks in a row. Let's see. And here's a question for Deborah. What form was the biochar in when it was applied? Was it in chunks or powder? Do you think there's a difference in the impacts of biochar depending on the form applied? So Deb, if you want to open your mic.
Yeah, I think you can hear me. So yeah, you know, we've used them all. We've used powder, we've used chunks, we've used some big chunks that were made in kilns. And yeah, it does make a difference at how quickly it moves into the mineral soil. You know, usually, you know, I think you saw in Kelpie's presentation, the biochar that comes out is probably Kelpie maybe 1 inch and smaller.
Yeah, it's a variety of sizes.
Yeah, and that's you know, the powdered stuff has been from early on from industrial manufacturers. Most of what we use now is mostly 1 inch and smaller in a variety of sizes, but yeah, it does make a difference.
And if you use biochar to remove heavy metals or organic toxins, is the char then toxic? Does it hold toxic things tightly enough to not endanger plants? And if it is toxic, what happens to it next?
You know, so far we've left it in the soil. You know, our studies are so new that we haven't even gotten to the point of, I mean, and the problem is, how would you take it back out of the soil? You know, because now it's more an integral part of what's in the soil. So yeah, I don't know. We have not seen that there's toxicity that moves from the biochar to the plant, but you know, a lot of those answers are still something that we need to work on because we haven't seen much of that yet. And you know, a lot of our work has been on mine sites that don't have toxic chemicals, but we are moving into looking at mercury remediation from some mine sites in Northern California. So yeah, I guess I don't really have a good answer for that.
You know, observation that I have about that is that if you look at coal, it's got mercury and other heavy metals in it. And and those aren't released until you burn it. So it seems like it does a good job. Carbon does a good job of hanging on to those things, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Eric has a question about NRCS cost shares, and we'll defer that until after we hear from NRCS, from Lori Schoenhoven. There's a question for Carlos. Carlos, do you have your mic open?
Yes.
Carlos, CJ asks, do you have any thoughts about where to begin promoting policy development for biochar?
Right now in Forest Service, I have been working with a team of experts to do an analysis of the current policies and regulations for the use of biochar. So that's I'm sorry, to the use of biomass for producing biochar. That is one part. And then the industry has to work with the International Standard Organization to check, also together with the USBI and the Biochar, International Biochar Initiative, to check where are the standards used in United States with those that have been developed by the European Union and the International Biochar Initiative, and also check if we can meet those standards. But also the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, which take care of also the standards for United States, has to be part of that. So it's a long process. Our Forest Products Lab also has to have some part in doing that. But the policy part has to be work in the states and also in coordination with USDA and EPA and other regulatory agencies that take part on the whole. Because one example is just, for example, thinking about the renewable fuel standards. Right now, they don't allow the use of raw material coming from national forests to be used as part of biofuels production. And biochar doesn't fit in this category of biofuels, but it depends about the classifications and definitions of biomass and this part of the analysis. So it's a lot of work coming on that area.
Okay. This is for Deb. Dan wants to know, what is the connection between biochar and decreased invasives? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so from what we understand, the biochar ties up nitrogen and makes the soil a little bit more nitrogen deficient. Invasive species really love nitrogen-rich soils, and so if the nitrogen is not as available, then the invasives don't become so pervasive across an area, and that gives the natives a chance to get established. Once the natives are established, they can help crowd out the invasive species. So, I think it's that link between the chemical properties of the soil and what the invasive species are really looking for when they try to get established.
Great. And here's another one for you, Deb, from Hannah. If you want to incorporate biochar into soils of grown forests with dense undergrowth, what would be the best way to approach it?
Yeah, we don't incorporate when there's forest floor that's intact or a lot of understory plants. We just put it on top, and that's part of the patience piece, right? Yeah, it's the skid trails, the log landings, places that are compacted, old roads that you can obliterate and mix in. Those are the places that we would say, yeah, you could mix in the biochar in those areas. But keeping the forest floor intact is probably the best way to hold moisture and keep nutrient cycling continuous. And so, yeah, we just broadcast it on.
Okay. And here's a couple of questions. Here's one for me. Dunbar asked, could you quench a kiln or a trench with soil, essentially just pouring soil over it with an excavator? Yes, I have quenched some kilns with soil. You need to be careful because if you get any air at all in there, you can lose a lot of your char, and it can also take a couple of days for it to cool down enough to empty it. So Do your own experiments there. I've done it successfully. I tried to quench a kiln with piles of steer manure one time, and it dried out the steer manure and started burning it by the time we came back the next day. So make sure your soil, if it has a lot of clay in it, that would help. And another question from Dale, can a biochar kiln be used during fire season? I haven't tried it. Do Carlos or Debbie have any thoughts on that? That we might be able to extend the burn season if we are using kilns, or perhaps air curtain burners?
You know, I would think that you could, mostly because you've got the fire contained, and there are very few sparks that come from the kilns or the air curtain burners. So I would think that, yeah, you could extend the burn season that way.
All right, so I'd like to introduce everyone to Karen Youngblood. Karen's a forest conservation specialist with the Redwood Forest Foundation. Karen's a naturalist and field biologist who's been working on ecological restoration in the California Redwoods and nearby natural environments since the 1990s. Karen joined the Redwood Forest Foundation Incorporated and USAL Redwood Forest Company in July 2018, where she manages the work to restore a forest of nearly 50,000 acres. Once a thriving ancient redwood and Douglas fir forest, overharvesting left the USAL redwood forest dominated by second growth Douglas fir and tan oak, with redwood struggling to survive. The Redwood Forest Foundation is restoring the forest, planting redwoods, and using sustainable harvesting practices that promote biodiversity, enhance carbon storage, and support local communities. I had the pleasure of working with Karen, doing a training session with her CCC crew last year, and they are an amazing force of nature. So let's hear what Karen talk about her project.
Thank you, Kelpie. I am very happy to be here today to share with you our biochar project on USAL Forest. And I have to say, it wasn't that long ago, a couple of years ago, I didn't really know that much about biochar, didn't think about biochar, talk about biochar, definitely didn't make biochar. And just, you know, it was actually due to Raymond Baltar from the Sonoma Ecology Center putting together this idea, this project proposal for assembling a kiln kit and getting different forest entities to try it out. You saw Redwood Forest Company being one, that really got us thrown into the whole world of making biochar, being on the ground, actually using these portable kilns in several different locations on USAL Forest. So thank you, Raymond, for introducing us to biochar. Raymond will be talking later today. And with this project proposal, we were not only testing these flame cap kilns, these portable flame cap kilns on USAL Forest, but the whole project started with a large training by Kelpie, with the training for our staff and for our labor crew, who happened to be the California Conservation Corps. So it just turned out that coincidentally, Raymond was able to secure funds to test the kiln kit, and at the same time, the California Conservation Corps was able to secure funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund grant program to do the work testing the kilns. So together, we were able to work for 4 months at 3 different sites on USAL Forest to test the feasibility, the costs, the benefits, and just work with these kilns and see how it works in a forest setting. So here's a map of USAL Redwood Forest in green. It's a 50,000 acre working community forest in northern Mendocino County, Northern California. On this map, this gray area highlights our proposed treatment area for fuel reduction along ridges to create shaded fuel breaks as part of our kind of long-term fire resiliency planning for our forest. So we felt like this area, this shaded fuel break ridge top zone was a perfect place to try these portable kilns because it was an area we had prioritized for fuel reduction and getting rid of the excess slash. So these 3 sites that are shown on the bottom of the map are our 3 primary locations where we tried the kilns. Millbank, I'll be talking about quite a bit, 5 acres. 5100 Road was 10 acres and Dugan's Opening was 3 acres. So together in this 4-month time, working with the Cs, we treated 18 acres, burning biomass and making biochar. So our project was called Biochar in Place Feasibility Project, and our main objective was to test the feasibility of using these kilns, look at the cost, the benefits in a forestry setting, and see if it was something that we could incorporate into our regular forest management activities. The primary steps of this on-the-ground project was pretty simple. It was select treatment areas, thin the stands to create the biomass, stage the biomass, burn the biomass to biochar, and then apply the biochar to the soils at the site where it was created. So the rest of the presentation will pretty much be taking you through, it will be a slideshow, photos of our different sites and working with the kilns with our California Conservation Corps crew and other workers who helped us with this project. This first picture here is of the Millbank site. As you can see, it's very dense. This is before treatment. There's not only a buildup of slash on the ground, but the live trees are young and very crowded. And this is within our proposed shaded fuel break area. So in desperate need of being thinned and having the fuel reduced. This site is the 10-acre site at 5100 Road. And this site, we didn't do any thinning of live vegetation. We just spent time piling excess slash that had built up over the years from previous activities, including logging and other projects. And then our third site, it was a 3-acre area that we thinned encroaching conifers. It was a meadow habitat restoration site, an area that historically was a 30-acre meadow and had shrunk in size from conifer encroachment down to 6 acres. So we started last year by thinning the encroaching conifers on 3 acres of the area and then burned the slash in kilns to make biochar. So here's a picture of our great workforce. This was the California Conservation Corps on our first day, our day where Kelpie came down and trained the crew and our staff. And the crew size varied throughout the time that we did this project. It was not always the same Corps members. We had from 9 to 15 people each day they were out working. And I would say over the duration of the project, we probably trained 60 Corps members. A component of our project was to look at the cost and feasibility of using heavy equipment to load the portable kilns, and compare that to the cost of using a manual labor crew. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So the first step for the Corps was, for the California Conservation Corps, was to pull the slash off the slope and stage it to prepare for burning for biochar. And I have to say that we did bring a professional forestry crew into 2 of our sites to do the thinning of the material. And so at this site, this is Millbank again, the trees that were thinned were all less than 10-inch diameter, and they, you know, on average, they were about 8 inches in diameter. So the base of the trees, you can see some of them in this photo here, were too big to burn in the kilns, too big really to just manually drag and pile. So we left them on the slope. We had the forestry crew who did the thinning cut the tops of the trees off so that when the seas came in, they could more easily drag the tops and the branches down to the landing below to stage for burning. This is a picture of the beautiful piles that the seas would make. They would cut the slash to size, to length, and pile it by size. And this really increased the efficiency on the day that we burned. However, it probably took more time than one might really want to invest in this project if you were paying out of pocket. So here we are on training day. First day, the kilns have just arrived and the Cs are taking the panels out of the truck and getting them ready to assemble. Here they are assembling them with wing nuts and bolts. These are the Ring of Fire kilns that the grant was able to purchase from Kelpie. And here we filled the kilns, and the Cs are learning how to light the fire using a propane torch. And here's another picture of getting the fire started. Starting the fire was definitely, it took a while for us to really learn the best way to get the fire started the quickest. When we first started using fairly wet wood and not really building the fire as well as we could have, it would take us almost 45 minutes to get the fire started with the propane torch. And you can see there's a weed blower there as well, which helps when you have wet wood to get it started. But 45 minutes was a really long time just to try to light the fire. And over the duration of the project, the Cs got really good at building the fire using the right kindling on top to get the light time down to 5 minutes. And then, of course, once the fires are burning, you know, we would spend the next 4 hours loading the kilns, keeping the flame going on the top. And again, because those piles were made so neatly and right next to where we set up the kilns, it was really efficient to just grab a big armful of wood and throw it on the fire. And in this picture, you can see the water trailer. This was provided by Raymond from the Sonoma Ecology Center as part of the kit. So this 500-gallon water tank with a pump attached that came with fire hoses and all that was needed for safety as well as quenching the fire at the end. At this site, in this picture, you can see 4 of the kilns, one in the background slightly, you can see the flame coming up. I think we actually had 6 kilns set up right here along this road with the water trailer in the middle. That was a really good, productive day. And again, another site loading the kiln. This is a site where we were not able to drive the water trailer right next to the kilns. There was a rocked road below this stand, and then there was a dirt road, a forest road above it. So the forest road had gotten pretty muddy from the rains, and the Seas actually walked the kilns in. They walked which was about, I don't know, 200 feet from the nearest rocked road. And we brought down an empty portable water tank and filled it up from the water trailer that was down on the rocked road below, that with an extended 150 feet of fire hose. So, with the right tools and a little bit of creativity, you really can get these kilns nestled into forest stands away from roads somewhat. This is back at Millbank. This is a landing. Landings were definitely the easiest sites to set up and to burn. You can have everything right on the landing, all the kilns and the biomass and the water. This is a picture of using the fire hose from the water trailer that was down below on the rocked road. So definitely pumping water uphill with a good pump, and it still was enough to quench the fire. So just like lighting the fire took some learning and was kind of an important part of the process, quenching the fire also was took a long time to quench the fire and make sure the coals were out and it was safe to leave for the night. Here are some kilns after the fire burned. This was from 6 hours of burning. And this picture on the left, you can see this was probably the most biochar that was made in a day in one of these ring of fire kilns. And I think Kelpie mentioned before that it's pretty easy to measure the amount of biochar you have by just with these ring of fire kilns. Just 1 foot in height up of the kiln is 1 cubic yard approximately of biochar. So these kilns are 4 feet tall. This is almost full. We did have some unburned pieces. They weren't completely burned. So I think all in all, we estimated about 3 cubic yards from this kiln. And again, you can see this beautiful biochar made in this kiln. And so someone was asking about the size of the biochar, and I would say we, had mostly 1-inch size pieces, but we definitely had some pieces that were a little bigger. And then over here on the right, we actually had 2 of these Oregon kilns, which don't require assembly. And we used these with our project with the 4 ring of fire kilns that we had when we had a large enough crew and enough room and water to use all 6 kilns. So once we disassembled the kilns, you can see there's, we've started the quenching process of this particular kiln on top and cooling off the metal panels, but you can see there's still lots of red hot coals down below the bottom of the pile of biochar. So the quenching process requires completely disassembling the kiln while the the Corps members continued to spray it down with water, and then we would even rake it out into a thin layer so that we could most safely put the fire out all around. And again, at this site, you can see in this picture some of the trees that had been planted a couple years prior. So we were careful. We had flagged all the young trees at this site, but once we made the biochar, we were able to just rake it not very far to put it around these young redwood trees. So the mechanical loading part of this project happened at the Millbank site, and we had these two large burn piles that had been built 3 years before from a logging operation. They were pushed up right next to the live vegetation, to these large trees. They were unsafe to burn as a conventional burn pile. So they were perfect. It was a perfect situation to take the wood from those piles and use it in one of these kilns to burn. And that gave us the opportunity to look at the feasibility of using heavy equipment. What we did, this kiln you can see is looks pretty big, and that's because we took 5 panels from the Ring of Fire kiln that are typically 3 panels. And once the 5 panels are bolted together, they're 10 feet in diameter. And we burned the same size wood. We did for a couple hours in the middle of the burn day, add 4 5-inch diameter pieces of wood, but we still tried to keep the material we used between 1 and 5-inch diameter. So this is a short video of the heavy equipment in operation. The 2 piles we found out were, it was worthwhile for the operator to take time disassembling the piles into smaller piles, because through the process of separating out the wood, the operator was able to kind of sift all the soil that was mixed in with the wood in the burn piles out so that it wouldn't snuff out the fire. We did this for 3 days. It took some, experimentation on how fast to add the wood, how much wood to add to keep that flame going on the top. The operator covered the cables with tin foil, and that worked to protect them from the heat. So the final step of our project was to put the biochar back on the forest soils. As part of this project, we wanted to set up monitoring plots to start collecting information on the effects of biochar in forest soils, on how it affects vegetation, how the soil properties change. We're still in the process of setting up data collection for those plots, but the Cs did get most of the biochar spread on the soils, and I was surprised how fast they were able to do it. They, considering the time we spent piling the biomass and burning the biochar, the actual biochar application took just a fraction of the time, but it was because we had just amazing work crew. There they are carrying the biochar up to the plot with buckets, 5-gallon buckets. They spread biochar at this site. This is the Millbank site, and all the slash has in this photo shows the site before we cleared all the slash off the slope, so it looks a lot better. a lot less fuels on this site than this picture shows, but we started the biochar application part, and it took them about a day to get about a half an acre covered with biochar. So I'm going to spend the next few slides is just spreadsheets that have a lot of our summary numbers. This has a lot of information, is kind of hard to read through, but I think the main thing I'm looking at here is this is just for the Millbank site, which was the only site where we did the mechanical and the manual. So this spreadsheet is kind of a summary of numbers looking at the differences of cost and production of manual loading versus mechanical loading. And if we were to pay for the Cs out of pocket, it definitely is a lot more expensive to pay for a large labor crew than it is for a two-person mechanical crew. So this number here at the bottom is our total cost, combining the cost for thinning the stand, piling, and burning. 72,000 for the Cs and 58,000 for the mechanical crew. I'm gonna go ahead and forward to the next spreadsheet that kind of synthesizes these numbers in a little bit easier to digest format. This is looking at the numbers again at Millbank, looking at 1 day of making biochar and comparing manual loading and mechanical loading. So here you can see we had 12 workers on average for the manual loading, 3 for the mechanical loading. We made 77, or we burned 77 cubic yards of biomass for the manual loading with 5 kilns and 52.5 cubic yards of biomass for 1 large kiln. And if you look at the amount of biochar produced, 11 cubic yards for the 5 kilns versus 7.5 cubic yards for the large kiln. And the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered is 3 metric tons for the manual loading and 2 metric tons for the mechanical loading. So what does that mean? It seems like the bottom line really is, well, how much does it cost? And here's just cost analysis, again, of the manual and mechanical loading. And you can see that, again, it's a lot more expensive, 32,000 an acre for the manual loading versus 5,000 an acre for the mechanical loading. This piling biomass figure, I think, is a place where we can really start to look at methods and efficiencies to reduce the cost and time. And this number for piling biomass for mechanical is sort of made up. It's based on what the cost of work for a day with heavy equipment would be, and it very well could have taken a lot longer than that, or a crew. So these figures are not perfect, but they gave us a sense on the cost if you were to pay out of pocket, and definitely made this kind of work, made us realize that, you know, this work has a lot of environmental and social benefits, but it is just very expensive and can be done at this point if you have grant funding for an organization like ours. So these are the numbers, the summary of all of our sites, and the number of days are highlighted in yellow. So for this project, we spent 6 days thinning stands at 3 different sites. Again, remember that was 18 acres, though 10 acres, we didn't do any thinning. A total of 31 days piling biomass, 18 days making biochar. And in that, we made 143 cubic yards of biochar and sequestered 38 tons of carbon dioxide. So the lessons we learned from this project, it's really important to take time to strategically select your treatment area to get the biggest bang for your buck. You need to consider access and availability of water. In California, you need to make sure your treatment areas will be permitted by CEQA. For us, that really means looking at the archaeology, the botany, the wildlife. You need to secure burn permits ahead of time. And it's good to have a biochar application plan. Our plan was to apply the biochar as close to where it was made as possible, so we didn't have to transport any of it in a truck. And we had a crew to distribute the biochar. So why should we do biochar in the woods? It is expensive right now, but it's a great climate solution in a setting where there's an immediate need for fuel reduction. We have a surplus of forest fuels, and it's just imminent that we improve our fire resiliency. It's excellent for educational outreach on climate solutions. It was a lot of fun working with the California Conservation Corps. They really enjoyed learning about biochar. They enjoyed the work. They actually, after this project, with another grant fund, purchased their own biochar kiln. So now they can take that kiln to other landowners they work with and teach them about making biochar. It was a great startup project to learn basic biochar making methods and really opened the door for us as a forestry company to start considering how best to scale up biochar, biomass to biochar work in a forestry setting. So this is something that we would like to continue to do. In fact, we have a project right now where we're looking at using a larger curtain burner as a method to scale up. And we have a lot of restoration work that we do just with what Debbie and Kelpie and Carlos were saying about increasing infiltration and water holding capacity and maybe increasing stream flow for salmon restoration. There's so much potential. So we're really excited to have been exposed to this, and we're still thinking about ways to make it work. But there's a lot of questions to answer. And thanks so much for your time. And I am going to sign off.
I'll go ahead and introduce Kai. So Kai Hoffman-Krull is Forest Health Manager for the San Juan Islands Conservation District. Kai joined the San Juan Islands Conservation District staff in 2020 as the Forest Health Manager after 5 years of running an ecological journalism nonprofit called Forage. Kai studied forestry and literature at Yale University and also holds a certificate in business plan development from the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. He has coordinated research projects in agriculture and forestry with the University of Washington, University of Montana, and Oregon State University in the San Juan Islands since 2014. He's co-authored peer-reviewed articles in biogeochemistry and agriculture, ecosystems and environment, and has written extensively for publications such as Growing for Market, Civil Eats, New Society Publishing, The Sound Consumer, Rodale Institute, and Stone Pier Press. Kai lives on Waldron Island, where he enjoys trail running, growing food, and managing his forest for biodiversity, plant resilience, and carbon sequestration. Kai, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks everybody, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the research that was conducted in San Juan County, mostly focusing on forest soil research that was just done over this last year, touching a little bit on some of the agricultural research that we did with University of Washington and University of Montana. The forest soils research was done with Oregon State University, and then talking about the Island Conservation Corps that we developed over the last 2 years that has really been taking on forest restoration activities, and then biochar production as a key focus area for our activities. So very much in relationship to the previous speaker who was talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps in California. We have a islands-focused conservation corps that is created in partnership with Western Washington University, where they receive 20 credits in ecological sciences, GIS, and biostatistical analysis over the year. So really an integration of academic coursework and studying mixed with field work and getting some hands-on restoration experience. So to dive in, let's see here. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. I think as most of us know, San Juan County has the same issues that are happening across the West Coast and really most of the United States. 85,000 acres in our area are anticipated to have need for fuel reduction treatments or at moderate to severe risk of wildfire conditions. And we also are part of the rain shadow climate of Western Washington. So we don't get all that rain that everybody talks about. And so our summers actually are quite dry, and DNR is predicting that our drought conditions will increase the most of any populated area in Western Washington over the next 20 years. So we certainly are trying to find climate resilient solutions for our forest ecosystems as well as our agricultural systems. And we have challenges with logging, traditional commercial logging, in large part because of this, our ferry system. Every load of logs that goes off has to deal with the extra time and costs of ferries. And so it really, most logging operations in the islands struggle to break even, if not lose money. And so this has created, among other reasons, a large amount of that excess fuel load that we were just talking about previously. So kind of before getting into the research side, I think everybody here probably has heard about terra preta, and that's been kind of a major subject. But I think one key area that oftentimes isn't talked about is sort of the local application of biochar in Washington, Western Washington, and specifically in the San Juan Islands as a part of historic agriculture by the Coast Salish people. So these are two people that live on Waldron Island. This is Sally and Chris Weaver, and their family has been gardening on this homestead site for about 70 years. And previously, before that garden area, it was a camas garden. And this is taken, black and white photo taken in the springtime. Obviously, you see newly tilled ground and some onions planted, but it was a great chance to sort of get a sense of the color. Even though it's black and white, it gives that distinction of color for this camas location. And again, this is located on Sandy Point, where the name is indicative of the soil type, very sandy. So most of the areas you actually can walk along the seashore and look up at the bank, and it goes from light brown sand to suddenly jet black soil about 3.5 feet deep. And that goes for about 70 feet. And then it goes straight back to light brown sand. And, there's still a lot that we don't know. I work with Northwest Indian College on the Lumbee Reservation extensively, and also with the Natural Resource Group at the Tulalip Reservation. And there's both some information we do know, as well as a lot of historic information that's been lost about how charcoal was incorporated into camas production. But certainly we know that burning was a regular activity in the fall after crop residues were harvested. Oftentimes punky logs were thrown in alder and other deciduous trees and smoldered and then produced a relatively higher amount of charcoal that was then incorporated into the soils. And we did some of these charcoal, carbon dated some of the charcoal in these soils to past 1500 years ago. And one of the key things is that as we were looking at 10 different farm sites, and we will touch on some of those results, this soil had twice the amount of cation exchange capacity or nutrient retention properties as the next highest soil. And the soil has basically not been amended for the last 70 years. It's had some seaweed brought up to it, but Bob Weaver, who was sort of the historical main gardener over the last really 40 years, would always sort of say, like, what are all these people worrying about with doing all this work to their garden? Like, my garden just grows food. And but he, at that point, I think didn't know that he had a little bit of an advantage with all this historic charcoal in his ground. So this is a summary then of the project that we worked on with OSU, and this was in forest soils, looking at 3 different key areas of forest soil types. We looked at a summit location, we looked at a sort of mid-slope intermediate site, and we looked at a low, sort of almost wetland setting that had obviously higher carbon and nutrient-rich soils. And we did this same study in the 3 different sites, basically looking at 2 different species type. We looked at white alder and Doug fir saplings. We incorporated 4 different rates of charcoal, and we did those replications 4 different times. So total of 96 different plots. Here you get a little view of the different sites, and we used great old homesteading tool of split cedar to mark the locations and to mark the amount of charcoal that was incorporated. And again, you can see the different rates of 0 tons per hectare, 20 tons per hectare, 40 tons per hectare, and 80 tons per hectare, really looking at sort of how do these concentrations link into different soil properties within that area. So a few key pieces. We found significant influence, as would be expected, in the water holding capacity that was consistent across all different treatments, with basically a direct correlation between the amount that was incorporated. Again, you can see here 0 to 20 to 40 to 80 tons per hectare, direct correlation to the water holding capacity increasing with the amount of charcoal incorporated into those soils. We also saw a direct decrease of the bulk density, and which obviously is creating a more fluffy aerated soil with the charcoal addition. So again, consistent findings all the way across the board, significant incorporation of that change of soil texture and structure with the incorporation of charcoal. And then, of course, total carbon content, consistent findings across the board. We're looking at these different rates of charcoal addition in the 3 different sites. Some of the most distinct difference was actually in this upper site, which would be somewhat to be expected, where we had more porous sandy soils with higher leaching. And then one of the most interesting findings was a consistent finding of decrease of basal respiration. As we almost all know, soils are these living, breathing ecosystems, set of different organisms that interact with these basic elements of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. And that respiration of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere was consistently reduced. And we saw actually the most significant reduction in the lower site, which is somewhat to be expected because of the highest concentration of carbon in those soils. So then, to summarize a little bit of the agricultural research, this dates back actually to 2015 to 2017. We did a similar style where we were looking at charcoal incorporation at just 20 tons per hectare, only looking at one application rate, but we compared both a control with nothing added. We had poultry litter or an organic chicken manure based fertilizer. We had charcoal, and then we had charcoal charged with that same poultry litter. And so in essence, the only difference there is the between the control and the charcoal is the charcoal, and then the only difference between the poultry litter plots, and the charged char, again, would be the charcoal, because the same amount of poultry litter was added to the charged charcoal as with the poultry litter plots. And here you can see a summary of the overall findings. Again, this work was done with Dr. Tom DeLuca and Dr. C. Gale. At that time, they actually were kind of moving around. They started at University of Washington and then transitioned to University of Montana, and then also transitioned to Oregon State. So even though I've been talking about these three different universities, all the work happened, happened with the same two researchers. And so the summary of those 2 years, when we looked at the combinations, moisture retention increased by an average of 35%, reduced soil nitrogen leaching by 30%, reduced phosphorus leaching by 40%, and again, a very stable form of charcoal that was found. So there's actually a lot more study results that can be shared, and some of those study results are incorporated on the San Juan Islands Conservation District website. This is a very high level summary, a lot more around biological activity, enzyme count, so more to be had there, but just a high level summary. But yeah, one of the key things I'm really wanting to talk about is this development of the Islands Conservation Corps, because I think as is being said, who's going to do all this work that we need to have done with forest restoration? And as was mentioned by the previous speaker, this work is expensive and takes a lot of time and energy and skill set. And so what are some of the methodologies of how we develop these crews to be able to do this work in an effective and cost-efficient manner? So this is a picture of our crew this year, really just a fantastic group of individuals. We have 11 folks, really a tight-knit, bonded group. They get together for board games outside of work and are just an incredibly hardworking and intellectually rigorous group. They're all reading and sharing articles consistently. We've been shipping them many different biochar research papers from across the globe, and they've been really diving into that and starting some of their own research projects actually this quarter. So we'll have some more exciting data to present at a later time. And I will just say that I think that the combination of academic coursework and research mixed with field work does create a different type of investment with the field work itself, because they are really getting to ask the questions of why are they doing it in the first place? What's the importance of these activities? And when they're actively intellectually engaged, it really creates a different level of physical involvement. And so we've really been getting reports back from our land management agency partners. They're having to really come up with a whole different classification of the Conservation Corps work for this group, because they're so actively involved in their day-to-day operations. So pretty fun. So here's a picture of Yuki doing some chainsaw work on one of these congested fir stands. That's a picture of Julia. And we actually have been doing our chainsaw work with the U.S. Forest Service has a chainsaw certification and training program. They've been generous enough to come out and work with our crew members and certify them and give them a series of different classes in technique and safety. And also now Zoe, who's the crew lead, and myself are now C certified sawyers, so we can actually do our own coursework. So we're creating sort of an in-house system for doing our chainsaw policy and safety work. We have been focusing a lot of our work around Gary Oak ecosystems. Gary Oaks, there's 3% of the Gary Oaks live in our region that were around at European contact. So definitely an at-risk species, and one that's very relevant for a changing climate because they are extremely drought tolerant, do well with, we're kind of at the northern edge of their range, and definitely they're seen as one of these species that, if given the right circumstances in terms of light access and soil types, that they can really thrive within some of the predicted climate adaptations that we're going to be experiencing. So to the biochar work. This is actually an example from last year, one of our first main projects. And so this was actually along a power line corridor, one of the main road access points for Orcas Island. And the utility company saw thinning work as in essence an investment on their line, the amount of money that they spend repairing their lines every year because of trees dying off from laminated root rot and other tree diseases, and then having those trees fall on their power lines. And then it's obviously a very expensive operation to get those back up and running, let alone the problems with losing power. So, so they paid for thinning work. Range Shadow Consulting, which is one of the local forestry businesses, conducted some of those activities. We did some of the easier felling activities, and then we did all of the post-processing and piling. And I think what's key here is that that work is already happening, right? That when forestry activities are occurring in this context, the piling is already a part of the operations, but traditionally those are just being burned down to ash. So we really advocated that there's a different operation that could be happening. And so you can see here, we piled logs, anything really beyond 4 inches in diameter were aggregated into these constructed nurse logs for decomposition. And then all the branch material or small stem material under 4 inches was aggregated into these piles. This is one design that a crew member came up with, a log cabin design that was definitely illustrated the most efficient production. In essence, you know, what you're looking for with these conservation burns is the consistent alignment of putting together small diameter materials so that it reaches coal stages all at the same time, and then is able to be extinguished with water. In this situation, we used a water truck, a 1,300-gallon water truck. In more remote sites for some of the Gary Oak restoration work we've been doing, we've actually just been using water backpacks and rakes, and then raking out the piles into the moist understory and extinguishing that with the water backpacks. So we're averaging right around just 2.5 gallons per pile. The piles are averaging about 5 feet diameter and about 4 feet high. So, and you can also see here in the top, we covered these piles all with wax paper, forestry wax paper, which is again a common practice for burn piles. Normally thinking about those turning to ash. Obviously in this situation, we're trying to maximize charcoal output. And we did some assessments on production efficiency. These log cabin designs were reaching a little bit north of 15% conversion rate. We were with most of the piles, we were getting somewhere in the range of 13 to 15%, sort of our average. Here's another site, and again, you can see that our focus is kind of on a quick and dirty methodology in terms of just trying to get these piles established. We're trying to find the most cost-effective and efficient manner to be doing this, and doing all of the piling as we're going through, right? So we're doing the cleanup as we're felling these trees. This is actually a site that the land bank is going to be planting Gary Oaks in over this coming year. And what's been great is that we've been basically utilizing these burn piles as planting locations. So we've actually been doing these sometimes in blackberry areas, in areas of reed canary grass, and actually utilizing the fire and charcoal production to eliminate the invasive weeds or exotics in that site, and then in essence create an established area for planting natives. And the first year results from the stuff that we did last year have been highly beneficial and effective in terms of actually not seeing many of those coming back. So again, just another example of this is actually the one great example that we're going to be trying to actually run some more data on this year, which is basically just laying the branches all in parallel and seeing if that changes anything from the example next to it, which is basically just sort of more of a TP style aggregation of small diameter inlet material. But again, you know, the basic concept that I'm sure most of you know is we're just trying to have all of this reach coal stage and then extinguish at that point. So this is an example of some of the burns we did last year. And again, lighting it off within, you know, we had to find sites it gets challenging when you're in a congested forest to find areas that are away from other trees, but we were successful. This site, we had about 250 different piles. We were able to construct about an average of 70 piles or so a day, 65 to 70 if there was some range. We were able to burn. This site was a little bit different because it was near a road, so we were having to be cautious about smoke potentially interacting with traffic, but we were able to be burning somewhere around 25 to 30 piles a day, and on more remote sites we've been able to average around 55 piles or so a day. Just another example of these piles burning, and you can see sort of the different stages going on. This one is reaching kind of just really getting going. This one's starting to reach more coal stage, so we took about 3 or 4 more minutes later we were able to be extinguishing this one. And then this is just a great example of a year later on one of the remote sites we worked on. We are in essence raking the material out to sort of spread out some of the charcoal. We've been doing some monitoring of the charcoal amount, and we tend to be getting somewhere in that range of 20 to 80 tons per hectare. Some of these sites, if you don't rake it out, you can actually be getting quite a bit more concentration levels than that. But the essence of this is, let's not move the material any more than we have to, right? The material, we take a tree down, we make a pile in an open area near that tree, we burn that material in process, we rake it out on that site, and then we use that site as a planting ground. And the best framework that we've been finding for those plantings has been a combination of kind of 1 to 2, maybe 3 bare root plantings, looking at some of those sort of mid understory species, especially some that are projected to be more drought tolerant. So we're actually using some species from the mountains and even eastern Washington to be planting, such as Saskatoon or serviceberry or blue elderberry. But then also doing a lot of plug plantings in these sites as well. So we've been planting camas and a number of lily crops. So that's been a fun way to sort of get a different tiers of plantings within these charcoal sites. So I zoomed through, and I only had 20 minutes, so maybe a good chance for brief Q&A, and then I'll hand it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Kai. That's really great work you're doing. Really exciting to see. We are going to do Q&A right now for both you and Karen, and then we'll take a lunch break. So
Great.
We've only got a few minutes left at this point. Would you like to unshare your screen?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Oh, just one, sorry, this was one piece I forgot to mention that was just a data point, is that this year, with a little bit larger crew, we've been counting that we're establishing right around 90 piles a day with our restoration work. We're able to basically restore, obviously it depends on the site, but we're able to basically be restoring somewhere between 1 to 2 acres per day of forest restoration activities. And then again, we're averaging our burns at around 50 to 60 piles per day. So that's kind of the data on our side.
Great. I'm sure you'll have more for us going forward in terms of data. Sure. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Question for Karen. What would you estimate the moisture content was of the brush that you were processing and the logs?
Yeah, we had moisture meters, and actually that was a fun exercise for the Cs to go through and measure moisture every day before we did a burn. And we averaged about 30%. We were mostly under 30%. There were a couple days where some of the wood at the top of the piles, we didn't cover any of our piles, and it did rain after they were staged. So there were some days where wood was as wet as 40-50%, but that was just a few pieces. And they definitely didn't burn very well. But we did try to keep it seemed like our wood was mostly under 30%.
30% is challenging. I usually try to recommend under 25%. So I see why he had some trouble lighting it.
Yeah.
But okay, so here's another question from Dave. How many times can the Ring of Fire kilns be fired? I think what he's trying to say is how durable are they? And you put them to the test.
Well, we used these kilns last year. I can't remember what I said for the total number of days we burned. Okay, it was 18 days. And then we passed this kiln kit on to another group who used them for several more burns. And we actually are using two of the same kilns again this year, and they're bent up, they're rusted, they don't look great, but they work.
Okay, thanks. And then Eric asks, the costs that were shown for the Mendocino Usal Forest, was that for a total of 5 acres treated? The costs? I think it was more.
No, let me think. Yeah, that cost was calculated based on the information we had at the Millbank site, which was 5 acres, because that site is where we did all of the activities. We did the thinning, we did the staging, we did the burning with both the manual crew and the mechanical crew. So that was the best site to analyze the cost.
Great. So we're supposed to be breaking now, but I want to go for just a couple more minutes to send some questions for Kai. And so let's see. Todd wants to know, does the biochar raise the pH of the soil? If so, how much?
For me, yeah. We found an average in the farm studies of with the 20 tons per hectare incorporation, an average of 0.6 rise in pH. And then the average, and actually you should probably go back to that slide to pull it up, but I think it was when we looked at the biochar pH that was averaging from the production we did this year, it was averaging, I think, 8.5, and that's from Doug Fir biochar. Actually, I can tell you the exact in just a second when I look at it. But yeah, I think it was okay. Yeah. No, sorry, it was averaging 8.0 from Doug Fir charcoal. So
here's another question for you. There's a lot of, this is from Walt. There's a lot of green in those burn piles. Do those piles burn cleanly? Would it make sense to separate the larger material from the leaves and needles and compost the green stuff with the larger material after it's charred?
Yes, that's a great question. So, we have really been tending towards the majority of those are green piles that are curing for a year, and then we put that wax paper on and then are burning them in the following fall. So that's really the methodology. We did do some green piles, and one key finding, last spring, which is not advisable, but what we did really find is if there's a base of dry material under that 25% number, Kelpie, that you mentioned, I think that's really, using moisture meters, that's also been a really key metric for us, is trying to get under that 25%. If you're able to get a really good fire going, we've been able to have good success layering green material on top of it and having it burn quite cleanly. It'd be great to actually get emissions data to actually support the nuances of that, but from the eye test, they've been burning quite clean. But again, that requires having that really hot fire to start with before starting to get that material going.
And here's a question for both of you from Brad Decky. How much are the forest workers paid per hour? Kai,
yeah, I can sure answer that. Yeah, so we, this is one of the reasons why conservation corps crews really across the country are based in the AmeriCorps model, is because it's really one of the only efficient ways, or cost-efficient ways, I think, to do some of this work. So, they basically get, when you include the living stipend and the education award they receive, it comes out to be right around $20 per hour. Our costs are really only about $11 per hour. And so we are able to, that's because AmeriCorps leverages federal dollars to be able to support individuals in this sort of work. So, it's really, again, a huge asset to be able to leverage some of those federal We charge $24.50 per crew member per hour. So our days tend to range right around $1,000 that we charge the land management agencies.
Great. And Karen, you want to?
So the numbers I'll give you are for our thinning crew and the mechanical operator. Our thinning crews, they do forestry work, stand improvement work for us year round. And so the work they did for the biochar project, they charged $2,700 an acre. And that was because it wasn't just simple thinning, it was thinning, plus we asked them to cut the tree tops off, and they had to do kind of a lot of, additional work that took extra time to get the site prepped for the seas to come in. And then the mechanical crew did the loading of the kiln with the excavator. It was a 2-person crew and they charged $800 a day.